The morning came in quiet, the way May mornings do in southeastern Nebraska. Soft light spreading flat across the prairie. The air still cool enough to raise a person's spirits before the heat remembered itself. She had been awake before the sun, as was her habit, moving through the soddy by feel and memory, lifting the iron latch on the cottonwood door, and stepping out into a world that smelled of damp earth and new growth. The corn had been in the ground for 3 weeks. She knew every row of it the way she knew the seams of her own palms. Planted in early May after 2 years of learning this particular piece of Nebraska, learning which low spots held water too long and which rises dried out fast, learning the way the wind came down from the northwest, and exactly how the south-facing window of their one-room home caught the afternoon light. They had put their second full spring into that field. 160 acres of claim, and the best of it running long and straight to the east. She walked the edge of the field simply to look, the way she did most mornings, ledger tucked under her arm out of habit. The seedlings had been coming in strong, knee-high by now on the good sections. Thick yellow-green stalks of open-pollinated dent corn standing in even lines like something to be proud of. She saw it before she understood it. One whole row, maybe 40 feet of it, simply gone flat. Not bent, not wind-damaged. The stalks lay sideways in the dirt, each one snapped clean at the base, the cut so precise it looked almost deliberate. She stopped walking. She stood very still. Then she knelt. She pressed 2 fingers into the soil near the nearest severed stalk and felt the loose, tunneled earth before she saw it. She worked her fingers deeper and turned up a pale, fat cutworm, curled like a secret the ground had been keeping. It was barely the length of her thumbnail. She set it on her palm and looked at it for a long moment. She already knew what it meant. She set the stalk down carefully, though there was no reason to be careful with it anymore. She opened the ledger to the first clean page and wrote the date, May 28th, 1878. Beneath that, she wrote 2 words, cutworms present. Then she stood and walked the length of that row, and then the next, counting the severed stalks with her lips moving silently. The second row was worse. The third had only begun. Underground, in every direction she could not see, something was eating the work of 2 years. She stood at the far end of the ruined row and looked back toward the soddy. Smoke was beginning to rise from the chimney. He was awake, starting the morning fire, not yet knowing. The light was golden and ordinary and beautiful. The way light can be when everything beneath it is going wrong. She closed the ledger. She started walking back. There was a great deal to figure out, and not much time to figure it. He was at the stove when she came through the door. She could see from the set of his shoulders that he had slept badly. He always held himself a little tighter after a poor night, as if bracing against something invisible. He turned when he heard her boots on the packed earth floor and read her face before she said a word. She showed him the ledger. He read the 2 words she had written, looked up, and then set it back on the table with the same care she had used when she'd set down that severed stalk. Neither of them said anything for a moment. He left before the morning had fully opened. She watched him saddle the horse and take the eastern track toward Deller's Crossing, 6 miles of grass and rutted trail. And then she turned back to the field because standing still was worse than moving. She walked every row she could before the heat came on. The count grew uglier by the hour. The worms worked at night and sheltered in the soil by day, but their work was written plainly above ground. Stalk after stalk clipped clean at the base. The plants collapsed sideways like small things that had simply given up. She marked each ruined section in the ledger with a small, careful line. By mid-morning, she had filled 2 pages with lines. He came back in the early afternoon. She heard the horse before she saw him and walked to the fence to meet him. He dismounted without hurrying, tied the reins, and stood with one hand resting on the horse's neck. He had the expression he wore when the news was as bad as expected, not shocked, just settled into it, the way a man settles into cold water. The feed merchant at Deller's Crossing had been direct. Lime sulfur dust. It was the remedy he knew, the one that worked, the one that wouldn't wait. He had quoted the price without softening it. It would take everything they had left. The coins they kept in the tin beneath the trapdoor in the root cellar, the small reserve they had not touched since the second winter, because it was meant to carry them through to a first real harvest. That evening they sat at the cottonwood table with the ledger open between them and a stub of candle throwing pale light across the pages. They went through it the way they always went through hard things, together and without flinching. The tin came up from the root cellar. They counted what was there. Then they counted what the dust would cost. Then they sat with the difference. She wrote down each option as they named it. Credit from the feed merchant. He had none to offer, not to homesteaders 2 years in. Borrowing from the Halversons or the Pratts. Both families were watching their own fields and counting their own coins. Waiting and hoping the infestation would pass on its own. She didn't even write that one down. She just shook her head and he nodded. The candle burned lower. The list of crossed-out possibilities grew. Outside, in the dark rows of yellow dent corn, the worms were still working. The candle had burned to a nub before she said it. She had been quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of someone who had given up, but the quiet of someone turning a thing over and over in her mind. The way you turn a river stone, feeling for an edge. He had watched her without pressing. He knew that quiet. He had married it. She said, "What does a hen do all morning in the yard?" He looked up from the ledger. "Scratches," he said. "Eats whatever moves. Every grub. Every worm." She set her pencil flat against the page. "I have never once seen a cutworm survive a morning in that yard." He was still for a moment. Then he said slowly, "The corn won't survive a morning in that yard either." "No," she agreed. "Not the way the yard works now." She pulled the ledger closer and turned to a clean page. She did not ask permission to think out loud. She never had. That was one of the things he had understood about her before he had understood much else. That her thinking was physical, something she did with her hands and a pencil, and the best thing he could do when she was in it was to stay close and pay attention. She drew a long rectangle. Inside it she drew 4 thin vertical lines, evenly spaced, and then small stalks between them. The rows, the young corn still standing. "The birds can't be loose," she said. "But what if they're held? A pen that sits over the rows instead of beside them, wide enough that the hens can work the soil between the plants without knocking into the stalks, low enough to keep them in. And then," she drew a small arrow at one end, "you move it forward, a little each day, like running a comb through the field." He leaned over the page. He studied the rectangle, the rows, the arrow. "How wide?" he said. She measured against the page with her thumb. 4 rows at a time. maybe 12 feet across. And long? Long enough that the hens aren't packed so tight they turn on each other. 30 feet, maybe. He sat back. The candle threw a long shadow across the wall. That's a lot of frame, he said. A lot of wire. The freight wagon, she said. The one that broke down behind the barn last fall. You said the wheels were still good. He had said that. He remembered saying it, the way you remember the small things that turn out to matter. The offhand remark, the detail noted and set aside for no reason you could name at the time. He looked at the drawing again, the rectangle straddling 4 rows, the arrow pointing forward, 500 hens scratching the earth clean one section at a time, while the corn stood untouched above them. It was not impossible. It was strange and untested, and it would take days to build, but it was not impossible. He reached across the table and turned the ledger so he could see it better. "Show me the wheels again," he said. He pulled the freight wagon wheels out from behind the barn the next morning, rolling them one by one through the wet grass while the sun was still low and the dew hadn't burned off the clover. 4 wheels, iron-banded, the rims scabbed with rust, but the spokes still solid. He tapped each one with a hammer handle and listened to the ring. Good. Not pretty, but good. He began cutting cottonwood poles the same afternoon. The creek bottom had a stand of young cottonwoods she'd wanted left alone for shade, but there were older ones further north, dead standing and dry, and he worked through them with the cross-cut saw until his arms ached, and his shirt was dark through. He hauled the poles back in bundles of 5, lashing them to the mule's harness with rope. Cobb bore the weight without complaint, the way Cobb bore most things, with slow, steady indifference that felt almost like patience. The frame took shape over 3 days. He notched the poles at the joints and bound them with strips of wet rawhide that would tighten as they dried. The old way, the way his father had taught him for fence building. The rectangle grew across the yard, 12 feet wide, 30 long, and she came out each morning with her coffee to look at it, walking the perimeter, checking the corners with her eye the way she checked figures in a column. She was not idle. While he built, she walked the field, every row, every section, crouching to examine the soil at the base of each seedling, noting the cut stems and the small telltale mounds of fresh-turned earth where the worms had moved in the night. The ledger filled steadily. She marked the worst sections with a strip of torn cloth tied to a stake, and by the end of the second day, the field looked like it was flying small flags of surrender. But she didn't see it that way. She said each flag was a target, and targets were something you could work toward. The chicken wire went on last. It had been stored in the barn in 2 long rolls, salvaged from a fence line they'd torn out the autumn before, and it was bent in places and needed coaxing. He stretched it section by section across the frame and secured it with wire staples hammered into the cottonwood, working around the top and sides until the runner was a long, low cage open at the bottom, open to the earth, open to the corn rows, open to the worms below. He hitched Cobb to the tongue on the morning of June 4th. She stood at the gate of the near hen yard with the ledger in her hand. They looked at each other over the length of the contraption between them. He said, "Ready." She opened the gate. The hens came out in a rush, a white and brown tide of feathers and quick feet, and flooded into the runner like water finding a low place. Within seconds, the scratching had begun. The sound of it, 500 birds working the earth at once, was something neither of them had quite imagined. They both stood very still and listened. The sound stayed with her the rest of that first morning, a dry, papery hiss, like rain on a tin roof, but lower, more deliberate, 500 small decisions happening all at once. She stood at the edge of the field and wrote June 4th. Rows 1 through 4, first pass. Hens settled immediately, scratching active along full length of runner. In the ledger, and then she stood a little longer, just listening before she went back to the cabin to start the midday meal. Word moved the way it always moved across that stretch of Nebraska, faster than a man could ride, slower than anyone expected. By the following Sunday, she saw the Halverson wagon coming up the track from the north, and before the morning was out, the Pratts had appeared from the west on foot, the whole family of them. Mr. Pratt walking with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, the way he always did when he was about to form a judgment. They stood at the fence. She counted 6 of them altogether, adults, leaning on the top rail or standing just behind it, looking out at the runner in the third section of rows, where the hens moved in their slow collective drift, heads down, feet busy, the cottonwood frame creaking faintly as Cobb shifted his weight in the traces. Mr. Halverson said it first. He said he had seen a good many things tried on a new claim, but he could not say he had seen anything quite like that. He said it without cruelty, almost with genuine puzzlement, the way a man speaks when he is trying to be fair and cannot quite manage it. Mr. Pratt was less measured. He said chickens belonged in a coop. Everyone knew that, and that by July there would be no corn worth speaking of and no eggs either. And what then? One of the women laughed, not unkindly, but the laugh carried. He was on the far side of the runner, checking the wire along the south edge where it had come loose from a staple the morning before. He heard all of it. He straightened up, looked across the frame and the birds and the rows of small green corn stands, looked at the neighbors at the fence, and tipped his hat. That was all. He went back to the staple. She was standing 3 feet behind the Pratts. She had the ledger open in her hand. She listened to everything said, and when the last of it was said, she wrote the date in a single line. Halverson and Pratt families visited. Runner on Section 2, rows 5 through 8. Worm count this section, low, corn standing. She did not write what had been said. She did not need to. What mattered was in the numbers, in the rows, in the condition of the corn. After the neighbors left, she walked to where Cobb stood waiting and unlooped his lead from the post. She spoke to the mule quietly, one hand on his neck, and moved him forward 1 full runner length to the next section. The hens followed, as they always did, into the fresh ground ahead. The ledger filled the way a good field does, slowly, then all at once. Through the first weeks of June, she recorded everything in her small, careful hand. The date, the section, the rows completed. Below that, always, the worm count, her own measure, drawn from lifting the soil at the leading edge of the runner before the hens went in. In the first week, the numbers were still troubling. 8, 11, 6 per linear foot of row. By the second week, they had begun to fall. 4, 3. Twice she wrote a single word beside the count. Low. Once, on a Thursday morning when the light came in level and gold across the field, she knelt and looked beneath the runner and watched a single hen drive her beak into the soil 4 times in under a minute and come up with something each time. She wrote nothing about that. Some things the ledger could not hold. Behind the runner, the ground changed color. It was not subtle. Where the hens had passed, the soil ran dark and close, almost the color of river silt, and she could smell the richness of it from 2 rows away. The corn in those sections climbed out of that darkened ground with a kind of stubbornness she had not expected. Thicker at the stalk, standing straighter, leaves broader than the rows along the field's east edge where the runner had not yet reached. She measured a stalk in Section 1 on June 19th and wrote the height in the ledger. She measured the same position in the untreated east border and wrote that height beside it. The difference was nearly 3 inches. She underlined it. Then July came, and July had no patience for either corn or people. The heat arrived on a Sunday and did not leave. The sky went the color of old tin. The wind out of the southwest was dry and relentless, and it moved across the field all day and into the night without cooling, only drying, pulling moisture from every surface it touched. The soil at the runner's edge cracked in thin lines by midday. The corn leaves began to curl at their tips, rolling inward like paper held too close to a fire. The hens suffered worse. They needed water twice a day in ordinary heat. In this heat, they needed it more than that, and the creek had dropped 2 feet in its banks since May. Every morning before the runner moved, he filled the long wooden trough inside the frame by hand, bucket by bucket from the barrel he hauled from the creek on the stone boat, Cobb pulling it slow and steady while the sun came up hard. She worked alongside him, refilling the smaller troughs at the trailing end, checking each bird for the slack, open-beaked look that meant trouble. They lost 3 hens in the first 4 days of that week. She recorded the losses in the ledger without ceremony. On the 5th day, the wind was so fierce it pushed the runner sideways off its line, and he had to reset the rear wheel twice before noon, his shirt soaked through, the dry air stealing the sweat before it could cool him. The wind quit on a Sunday. After 5 days of it, the silence felt strange, almost suspicious, like something holding its breath. He stood at the soddy door that morning and looked out across the field, and what he saw stopped him where he stood. There was a line, not a fence line, not a creek line, a line drawn by the work itself, clean as a ruled mark in her ledger. On the runner's side, the eastern 2/3 of the field, the corn stood straight and close, the stalks thickening toward their second joints, the leaves dark and wide and reaching. On the western edge, the section still waiting, the stalks were ragged things, sparse, leaning. Some bent nearly to the soil, the bases chewed through and browning. The cutworms had not slowed. They had simply moved where the hens had not been. She came to stand beside him. She didn't say anything for a moment. Neither did he. Then she opened the ledger to the current page, ran her finger down the column of row numbers, and said quietly that they had 41 rows left to run. 41 rows in a field that was dying from the west inward. They ate standing up that morning. The runner went out earlier than usual, while the air still held the coolness of the previous night. He worked the mule harder than he liked to, keeping the pace just above the animal's comfortable walk. And when they stopped to water at midday, he apologized to Cobb in a low voice, smoothing his hand along the animal's neck, meaning it. The mule's ears moved once in acknowledgement or indifference. It was hard to say which. She kept pace with the runner's trailing edge, watching the hens work. They were good at it by now. They had been doing this for nearly 2 months, and they knew what the movement of the frame meant. They moved with it, not ahead of it, spreading across the 4 rows with a kind of practiced efficiency that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with 500 birds having learned where the food was. She counted their passes, noted the worm density in the new rows, still heavy, the worst yet, and wrote her numbers in the ledger while she walked. 6 days straight they pushed. No full rest. Sunday came and went without ceremony. The corn on the western edge thinned a little more each morning before the runner reached it, and every dawn she stood at the field's edge and measured the gap with her eyes before writing in her notebook with the kind of calm that was not ease but discipline, the decision not to let the numbers on the page become the fear they represented. On the 6th evening, he sat on the stone boat step and looked at the field in the last light. The line was still there, but it had moved west. Just 3 rows, but it had moved. She brought him water and sat beside him, and they watched the light go out of the sky over the corn without saying much, because there was nothing yet to say. The invitation came on a Tuesday morning, carried across the north pasture by Margaret Halverson herself, a practical woman who walked fast and asked for things plainly. She stood at the soddy door and said she wanted a second pair of eyes on her corn before she gave up on it entirely. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. They went together, the 2 women, leaving the men to move the runner through its morning pass. The Halverson field was a 1/4 mile north, and she saw the trouble before she reached the first row. The soil had gone pale and loose between the stalks, the color of ash, as though the ground itself had lost something. She stepped between 2 rows and crouched down without being asked. The stalks were still standing, most of them, but they stood the way exhausted things stand, narrow at the base, the lower leaves yellowed, the whole plant giving the impression of height without substance, like a scarecrow. She walked the rows slowly. Margaret walked beside her and said nothing, which was its own kind of trust. Half the field was simply gone, not dramatically, no obvious ruin at the edges, no clear line where the damage stopped. It had happened in patches, the way these things always did, worms moving through soil the way water found the lowest path. Where the corn remained, it was spindly and pale. She pulled a handful of soil near one stalk base and found the tunnels without looking hard. The slight hollows, the frass, the telltale looseness of ground that had been worked from below. She did not say, "I told you so," because that was not the kind of woman she was, and it was not the kind of morning that deserved it. She said, "I'm sorry. I know how much you put into it." That was all. Margaret nodded once, and they walked back to the farm road together without ceremony. That evening, she told him what she had seen, going over it methodically the way she went over the ledger. Row, conditions, soil texture, estimated loss. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the field map she had been keeping, the one tacked above the washstand, and was quiet for a long moment. They could spare 40 hens for 2 weeks, he said finally. Maybe 50. Not enough to save the Halverson corn. She already knew that, and he knew she knew it. But enough to begin working the soil, to demonstrate the method, to give Margaret and her husband something to do with their hands that felt like fighting forward instead of just watching the damage. She agreed without hesitation. The next morning, they walked north together at first light, 50 hens moving in a loose, bickering procession ahead of them, and she carried the ledger under her arm, not because she would record the Halverson rows, but because it felt wrong to leave it behind. The 50 hens they lent north came back at the end of the second week thinner and louder, as though 2 weeks of Halverson soil had given them opinions. She counted them in at the gate, matched the number against the tally she had kept in the back pages of the ledger, and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite relief. The Halverson rows were too far gone for 50 hens and 2 weeks to rescue, and she had known that going in, but something quieter than relief. The knowledge that they had done what could be done. July passed in heat and repetition. Cobb pulled the runner forward each morning, the wire sides flexing and rattling, 500 birds working the soil with the patient industry of creatures who had no notion they were saving anything. She checked the ledger each evening by the south window, the numbers going orderly across the cloth-bound pages. Rows completed, days per section, worm counts dropping week by week until the column she had labeled active infestation stood nearly empty. By early August, the difference between their field and the Pratt ground to the west was no longer a matter of looking carefully. It was simply there, visible from the farm road, visible from the low rise where the road curved toward Deller's Crossing. Their stalks were shoulder-high on her and climbing. The Pratt stalks, what remained of them, stood ragged and half their height, the leaves pale at the edges where the damage had started and never fully stopped. She did not go over to look. She had no need to, and it would have felt like gloating, which was the last thing she wanted. She recorded the condition of their own rows instead and let the ledger speak. It was the middle of August when she went out to find him already in the field at dusk, moving slowly between the rows in the long, amber light. He was not working. He was walking the way a man walks when he is trying to believe something that has been a long time coming. She watched him from the edge of the field, the way his hand came up and found the nearest ear, ran along its husk, tested the weight of it. Fat and tight, the kernels already pressing the wrap. The soil between the rows was dark and loose, turned over and over by months of scratching feet, enriched by everything the hens had left behind. She walked in and stood beside him and did not say anything at all. Neither did he for a long moment. The light was going amber to copper to the particular burnt orange that came just before it dropped behind the western ridge. He said quietly that he thought they were going to make it. She said she thought so too. They stood there in the cooling air while the last light moved slowly up the stalks, and the ears hung heavy all around them, and the field was very still. The 22nd of September came in cool and clear, the sky that particular hard blue that meant the season was turning for good. He had the mule hitched before first light, and she was out behind him with the ledger tucked under her arm, the pages swollen now with 4 months of entries. Rows numbered, days counted, worm counts dropping from alarming to moderate to absent. Her handwriting growing steadily calmer as summer wore on. They did not speak much that morning. They did not need to. The work was the last of it, and they both felt the weight of that. Not heaviness, but something closer to fullness, the way a long-held breath finally releases. The Halversons came first, arriving in their wagon just after mid-morning, the mister on the seat and his wife beside him. They pulled up at the field's edge and climbed down without fanfare. Then the Pratts came, on foot across the western pasture, Mr. Pratt with his hat in his hand, his wife walking quietly at his side. They had lost the better part of their crop by July. They did not say so directly, but it was there in the way they moved, slow, watching, a little humbled by the standing rows ahead of them. Because the rows were standing, every last one. The ears hung full and golden, the husks packed tight, the stalks still upright where the Halversons had bent and where the Pratts had barely filled at all. She watched her neighbors take it in, the length of it, the color of it, the sheer, unbroken fact of it, and she felt no triumph in the watching. What she felt was quieter than that and harder to name. The final wagon was loaded by early afternoon. He stacked the last of the sacks himself, checking the weight of each one, and then he climbed down and stood beside her at the field's edge. She put her hand in his. His thumb closed over her fingers the way it always did, the small, familiar pressure of it, and they stood there while their neighbors stood around them in the cooling air. It was Mr. Halverson who stepped forward. He turned his hat over once in his hands. He said he had 160 acres of his own, and he reckoned he would be putting corn in again come spring. And he wondered, if it was not too much to ask, whether he might borrow the design of the runner, just to look at, just to understand the dimensions of it. She opened the ledger without hesitation. Near the back, on a page from early June, she had drawn the frame in careful pencil, the pole lengths, the wheel placement, the wire spacing, the dimensions Emmett had called out while she wrote them down. She tore it loose along the binding and held it out to him. He took it in both hands, as if it were something worth keeping, which it was.